Hi everyone, so we have the Fascist State 1995 to 40. We have the four questions of how successful was Mussolini's attempt to control the population, what was the nature and importance of Mussolini's relationship with political and economic elite, how successful did Mussolini's economic plan achieve their aims, and how far did the relationship with Mussolini and the Catholic Church impact his fascist dictatorship. So we have the first question. So indoctrination of the youth. December 1921, fascist youth formed for the boys between 14 to 17 years. The GUF was made in 1923 in March, along with the creation of the Balia for children aged 8 to 14. 1924, 3,000 children formally involved. 3rd of April 1926, the OMB created, providing physical and moral benefit through education for boys to 8 to 18, along with the 1934 Balia separated into three sections: 6 to 8, the Della Lupa; 8 to 14, the Balia; and 14 to 17, the Avanguardisti. Girls were now included in their own organisation, the Vigili della Lupa. From ages 6 to 8, the Little Italians from 8 to 13, and the Young Italian Women from 14 to 17. These organisations were under the control of the party to the Ministry of National Education, which had been created in 1929 to oversee both scholarly education and physical training of Italian youth into fashion. So we have a bit more. So Fascist Italy banned all youth organisations except those run by the Catholic Church, aiming to indoctrinate young people. Boys from 8 to 14 were taught moral and spiritual defence, and from 14 they focused on physical training for military life. They were taught loyalty to Mussolini, to prepare to die for their country, teaching the girls to be fit like mothers, to raise patriotic children, and in schools they learn about patriotic Italians, like comparing Caesar to Mussolini. Textbooks promoted fascism as the saviour of Italy, and anti-fascist teachers were removed, with the PNF memberships becoming compulsory for teachers. By 1937, 7 million young people were in the fascist youth organisation, but membership wasn't always due to the belief in fascism. Many joined for social reasons, sport, to avoid employment restrictions. The policy's success wasn't even, with less participation in rural South and amongst girls, who often found their activities less engaging than the boys. It is debated these groups truly created loyal fascists or if members simply just enjoyed the activities. However, many dedicated fascists in World War II did come from these programmes. Then have the OND, and it was the most popular aspect of the fascist regime. After the implementation of the fascist dictatorship, the social organisations for workers' recreation and the welfare had been closed. 1925, the OND replaced them. This provided the workers with a considerable variety of social and sporting opportunities, including bars, billiard halls, cycling groups. Each OND section typically had a clubhouse, and a recreation grounds where activities were provided. The OND membership was entitled workers to rail ticket discounts, as well as other consumer benefits. The most popular aspect was the subsidised holidays. It provided where workers could take their families to mountain retreats, events, or the beach. 1939, over 4 million members, and around 80% of all states and private sectors salaried workers were members of the OND, as were 40% of Italy's industrial workers. However, it is interesting to note that the fascists took particular care to make the OND ideological free. None of the sporting, social and educational activities were encouraged to go on the feature of any promotion of fascist belief or ideology. This reflected Mussolini's leadership and contributed his popular appeal. However, the fact that the workers could benefit from the OND without any real commitment to the ideals of fascism, and it is clear that many simply joined because of the mass range of services it provided. With some within the PNF complained that the OND made no attempt to provide fascist education to workers. The participation with fascism by the mass of Italian population was important. Mussolini believed as a form of control in comparison to direct ideological indoctrination that might discourage workers from OND membership. Then have the press and censorship. So in 1923 and 25, the PNF introduced decrees that restricted the freedom of the press in Italy, and at the end of 1926 they were formalised into laws sanctioned by the Parliament. Prefects had the owner to suspend publication, replace editors, and shut down offending newspapers completely. Left-wing newspapers such as Avanti were all closed, and all journalists were operated into fascist union. Journalists had stories they weren't allowed to write about, i.e. crimes and suicide, etc., and were told specific instructions on what to write and how to write it. Mussolini was more interested in controlling the press as opposed to banning the newspapers. His fascist newspaper Popolo d'Italia had circulation of 100,000, and Osvarator remained popular with a circulation of 250,000. Fascist newspaper accounted for 10% of newspaper sales in Italy. They also used a printing press to write positive stories about Mussolini. and independent newspapers were existing, but they were under strict control and guidance. Overall successful in controlling the fascist regime and therefore successful in controlling the image of Italian society, the PNF made it extremely difficult for any Italians to see any alternative views about the fascist apart from the good things. We now have the cult of Il Duce. This was an image propagated through posters, cinema, newsreels, and radio broadcasts that sought to portray Mussolini as a leader of immense ability who was leading Italy to greatness. This is clearly represented in the fascist slogan "Mussolini is always right." An incredible 30 million pictures of Il Duce is around 2,500 different poses were circulated throughout Italy. The image portrayed Mussolini as a modern dynamic leader who was brilliant sportsman as well as internationally respected. Unlike other political leaders, Mussolini was frequently photographed shirtless, portraying a leader of strength. His image as a man who was attractive to the opposite sex was a key part of the cult, but so too was the portrayal of Mussolini as a traditional family man. These contradictions, as opposed to the weakening of the cult of Il Duce, actually helped strengthen it. Mussolini was a leader who appealed to everyone. As he strengthened his dictatorship, his image as a lone leader above his party and the nation became more pronounced. He was without friends who would distract him from his work. This gave Italians hope that would lead the nation to greatness. However, there were key problems associated with this political propaganda. Mussolini's image of the focus of dictatorship was much more popular than the PNF and fascist ideology, and it's questioned how far fascism can be described as simply Mussolinism. If this is true, goal of fascism was to transform the Italian people into more militaristic culture, then the old cult of Il Duce did not achieve this. Instead, it focused on the worship of one leader as opposed to an ideology it would sustain itself after either Mussolini died or could no longer carry on. It is therefore difficult to consider fascism being able to survive without Mussolini. Finally, it can be argued that as the 1930s progressed, Mussolini became less inclined to see the cult of Il Duce as simply as a propaganda myth, and instead to believe in it himself, thus explaining more radical and aggressive policy direction from 1935 onwards. The influence of fascist culture. The PNF producing a cultural revolution that perpetuated the ideas of fascism was a key part in their attempted transformation of Italian people into loyal fascists. The PNF produced policies for the artists and intellectuals in Italy following the establishment of the dictatorship between 1925 and 26. The art served the goals of fascist state and helped create and sustained the fascist myth and images that were the heart of dictatorship. National Institutes of Fascist Culture were created in 1926, and artists and intellectuals organised into particular associations. I'm just going to let you guys read the rest. I'm going to kind of summarise this down because I don't think it's insanely important. So while the organisation of artists and intellectuals was efficient in controlling what was produced and ensuring that it helped boost the image of Mussolini and the PNF, it was never focused in a coherent matter with a key message that would resonate with Italian people. It lacked an intellectual giant such as the poet D'Annunzio, who would inspire the population in a popular appeal to the goals of fascism, and is therefore questionable to what extent, if at all, the fascist culture had any transformative effect on the Italian nation. We now have repression and terror. So Mussolini undoubtedly tried to sustain fascist power through popular organisations such as the OND, but it is clear that repression of political opposition also played in a key part. November 1926, he introduced the legislation that banned all other political parties and suppressed any Italians that tried to protest against the dictatorship. Death penalty was reintroduced for anyone who tried to assassinate the king or Mussolini, or who threatened the state security. So it was also the special tribunals could send any political dissidents into exile. Although exile may not seem as a considerable punishment, it's worth noting that it was financially devastating for many who were sent away, and their families faced considerable discrimination from the fascists. It was also seen as dangerous to employ anybody who had returned from Confino, the place where people sent, and the police division was formed in the late 1926 under Boccini, and were successful in its infiltrating and breaking up anti-fascist organisations. Italian secret police known as the OVRA in 1927 was formed to spy on Italians across Italy and ensure they were able to stamp down on any domestic anti-fascist sentimental activities. Estimated about 5,000 informers operating in Italy, and the OVRA was successful in stopping these. So they spied on universities, businesses, fascist unions. They could be located anywhere, and they were successful in suppressing opposition to the PNF. It's estimated that they held on over 130,000 Italians and prosecuted 13,547 cases and around 27,742 years of jail time. Around 10,000 Italians were sent to confino and hundreds were arrested every week for anti-fascist activities. In fact, Mussolini's greatest concern was with national security. It did not come from any anti-fascist at all. Instead, he was mostly worried about nationalist movements along the Sclavonists who lived in the Italian borders. They were restricted in their culture and speaking their own language and faced considerable oppression from the fascist authorities. Overall, it's difficult to make a judgment to the extent to which fascists relied on repression. Anti-fascist activities and organisations were suppressed successfully, but the numbers of arrests and sent to jail or confino made it difficult to judge the extent of anti-fascist feeling within Italy. Whether Mussolini relied on repression, popular policy of cultural injuries to sustain his regime is a key debate between historians. We then have anti-Semitic decrees. So there are around 45,000 Italian Jews in the country, less than 1% of the population, and they'd actually joined the fascists, and Mussolini had a Jewish mistress for years and appointed a Jewish finance minister in 1932. However, in 1938, anti-Jewish legislation was introduced that forbade Italian Jews from marrying pure Italians, holding public office jobs such as teaching, owning more than 50 hectares of land, running any businesses with over 100 employees, or employing pure Italians as servants. Foreign Jews were simply to be deported. Over the next 3 years, 6,000 Jews left the country, and businesses closed down, and students were expelled from schools. While it is true that the anti-Semitic policies came around and the Nazis were pursuing a harder time on the Germans, there is no evidence that Hitler pressured the Italian leader to implement anti-Jewish policy. Italians needed to develop a racial mentality that gave them a greater sense of superiority over foreign races, and it's worth noting that anti-Semitic policies came out at the same time as reform of customs. This was an ideological campaign that forced all civil servants to wear uniform, and army and military to adopt Passo Romo or goose step, which Mussolini had witnessed in Germany and believed made the army look more imposing. Italians were forbidden to shake hands, which was seen as foreign and bourgeoisie, and instead had to greet each other with a straight arm salute known as the Roman salute. These policies mirrored the anti-Semitic degrees that happened in the idea that it was a greater transformation of Italian people into radicalised society preparing for war. The anti-Semitic policies were representative of the Italian people with no history of anti-Semitism. The Pope condemned the anti-Semitic policies as an attempt to copy Nazis, and the Italian people viewed the policies as a worrying sign of Italy's growing weakness and subordination to German policy. But the policy of Mussolini was to unite Italian people into a more radical fashion was a considerable failure. Not only did it lose support from the conservatives of the church, business and judocracy, which Mussolini relied on power, it caused many Italians to question the direction of fascist policy, as the PNF appeared to be pursuing a more radical policy that was pushing Italy into a dangerous and concerning direction.